The scream tore through the mountain valley, just as Hawk Zimmerman crested the ridge with a string of beaver pelts slung over his broad shoulder. And he knew before he even turned around that something was terribly wrong at his homestead, 5 miles below. Black smoke billowed against the crystalline blue sky of the California mountains, thick and ominous, rising from exactly where his barn stood. Hawk's heart seized in his chest as he dropped the pelts and broke into a dead run down the rocky slope, his long dark hair whipping behind him, powerful legs eating up the distance with desperate speed. His mind raced through everything he had left behind that morning when he had set out to check his trapline before dawn: the horses, his mule, Stubborn Sally, the milk cow and her calf, the chickens, his old hound dog Rufus, who slept in the hay when the mountain nights grew cold. The year was 1876, and Hawk had carved his life out of these unforgiving Sierra Nevada foothills with his own 2 hands, building his cabin and barn log by log after leaving behind a world that had never quite fit him. He had survived grisly attacks, brutal winters, and the loneliness that came with choosing solitude over society. But the thought of losing the animals that had become his only companions made his blood run cold in a way no physical danger ever had. As he crashed through the pine forest, branches tearing at his buckskin shirt, he could hear the terrified screams of horses and the frantic sounds of panic. The smoke grew thicker, acrid and choking, and then he burst into the clearing where his homestead sat and stopped dead in his tracks. A woman stood in the center of the chaos, her long auburn hair coming loose from its pins, her pale green dress torn and blackened with soot. She had his horses on lead ropes, 3 of them dancing nervously as she tied them to the corral fence far from the blazing barn. Even from this distance, Hawk could see her face was streaked with ash and sweat, her movements quick and purposeful despite the obvious danger. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames licking through the roof, timbers groaning as the structure began to collapse. But the woman did not hesitate. As soon as she secured the horses, she ran back toward the inferno, and Hawk's paralysis broke. "Stop!" he roared, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. "Get away from there!" She either did not hear him or chose to ignore him, because she disappeared into the smoke at the barn's entrance. Hawk's powerful legs propelled him forward, covering the last 100 yards in seconds. He could feel the intense heat even from 20 feet away, could see the way the main support beams were starting to buckle. If she was inside when it came down, she would be crushed. He had just reached the barn door when she emerged, coughing violently, dragging Stubborn Sally by her halter. The mule was terrified, eyes rolling white, but the woman kept her grip firm and led the animal away from danger with surprising strength for someone of her slender build. "The cow," she gasped, shoving the mule's rope into Hawk's hands as she stumbled past him. "Still inside with the calf." "Like hell you are going back in there," Hawk growled, but she was already moving, wrapping a piece of her torn skirt around her face as a makeshift mask against the smoke. Hawk thrust the mule's rope around a fence post and went after her, his longer stride catching up quickly. If this foolish, brave woman was determined to die saving his livestock, then he would be damned if he would let her do it alone. The interior of the barn was an inferno, flames climbing the walls, hay burning with intense heat that made the air shimmer. His eyes watered immediately, and he could barely see through the thick smoke. "Where?" he shouted. "Back stall," the woman called back, her voice muffled by the cloth over her face. "I could not get her to move before." They found the cow pressed into the corner, the calf bawling in terror beside her. The animal's eyes were wild with fear, and she swung her horns dangerously as Hawk approached. A burning beam crashed down 10 feet to their left, sending up a shower of sparks. "Easy, Marigold," Hawk said, his deep voice somehow cutting through the chaos. He had raised this cow from a calf herself, and she knew his voice. "Easy, girl, we are getting you out." The woman had already scooped up the calf, somehow managing to lift the 60-pound animal despite her own exhaustion. Hawk could see her arms shaking with the effort as she turned toward the door. "Go," he commanded, grabbing Marigold's halter. The cow resisted for a moment, then seemed to understand and followed him toward the exit. Behind them, more of the roof gave way with a thunderous crash. They burst out of the barn into the clear air just as the entire structure began its final collapse. Hawk kept moving, pulling the cow away, distantly aware that the woman was running beside him with the calf still in her arms. They made it to the corral fence and finally stopped, both of them collapsing to their knees in the dirt, gasping for air. Hawk's lungs burned, his eyes streamed with tears from the smoke, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. Beside him, the woman had set down the calf and was coughing so hard her entire body shook. He could see burns on her hands where she had touched hot wood, blisters already forming on her palms. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded once he could speak, his voice rough with smoke and fear and anger born of terror. "You could have died. They are just animals, not worth your life." The woman turned to look at him, and for the first time, Hawk got a clear view of her face. She was young, probably 23 or 24, with delicate features now covered in soot and ash. But her eyes, bright green like new spring leaves, blazed with an intensity that matched the fire still consuming his barn behind them. "They are not just animals," she said, her voice hoarse but fierce. "They are living creatures who depend on you. I was not about to let them burn to death if I could prevent it." Hawk stared at her, this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere and risked her life for his livestock. "Who are you? What are you doing on my land?" "My name is Thea Riley," she said, still trying to catch her breath. "I was on my way to San Andreas when my wagon lost a wheel about a mile from here. I was walking to find help when I saw the smoke." She gestured toward the burning barn, now nothing but a collapsing skeleton of flames. "I thought someone might be trapped inside, but when I got here, I only found the animals." "You should have just kept walking to town," Hawk said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how ungrateful they sounded. This woman, this stranger, had saved everything he cared about, and he was snapping at her like a wounded bear. Thea's expression softened slightly. "I could not do that. I just could not." Behind them, old Rufus came limping out from wherever he had been hiding, tail between his legs. The hound dog made straight for Hawk, pressing against his leg and whining. Hawk ran a hand over the dog's head, reassuring himself that his old friend was unharmed. "Did you get the chickens out too?" he asked, looking around at the chaos of his homestead. The barn was still burning, but the flames were starting to die down now that there was nothing left to consume. Animals were scattered everywhere, all of them looking frightened but alive. Most of them scattered on their own when the fire started, Thea said. "I saw at least a dozen run into the woods. I am sure they will come back when things calm down." Hawk pushed himself to his feet, his muscular frame unfolding to its full height of well over 6 feet. He extended a hand to help Thea up, noticing for the first time how much smaller she was than him, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. When she took his hand, she winced at the pain from her burns, and guilt flooded through him. "You are hurt," he said, his voice gentler now. "Come to the cabin. I have salve for burns." Thea nodded, swaying slightly on her feet. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the shock and exhaustion were clearly catching up with her. Hawk slipped an arm around her waist to steady her, feeling her lean against his solid frame as they walked toward his cabin. The small log structure had escaped the fire, sitting as it did a good 50 yards from the barn. Hawk guided Thea inside, settling her into the single chair at his rough-hewn table. The cabin was sparse but clean, everything in its place in the way of a man who lived alone and liked order. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, his bed another, and the table with 2 chairs sat near the single window that looked out over the valley. Hawk moved to a shelf and pulled down a tin of salve he had made himself from bear grease and healing herbs an old Miwok woman had taught him to identify. He knelt before Thea and gently took her hands in his, examining the burns. "This will hurt at first," he warned, "but it will help them heal faster." Thea nodded, biting her lip as he carefully applied the salve to her blistered palms. Her hands were small and delicate in his large, calloused ones, the contrast stark. Hawk worked with surprising gentleness for a man of his size and rough living, his touch careful and sure. "I never properly thanked you," he said quietly, not looking up from his work. "What you did, saving my animals like that, risking your own life, I have no words for what that means to me. I am sorry I spoke harshly. I was afraid when I saw you going back into that barn." "You do not need to thank me," Thea said softly. "Anyone would have done the same." Hawk looked up at her then, his dark eyes meeting her green ones. "No," he said firmly. "They would not have. Most people would have kept on walking, or at best would have made a safe attempt and given up when it got dangerous. You went back in again and again. That takes a rare kind of courage." A faint blush colored Thea's soot-stained cheeks. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. Animals were part of our family. I could not bear the thought of them trapped and afraid." "Were?" Hawk asked, catching the past tense as he wrapped her hands in clean cloth. Thea's expression grew distant, sad. "My parents died last year from fever. My brother inherited the farm, and his new wife made it very clear that there was no place for me there anymore. So I decided to come west, to California, to start fresh. I have a small inheritance from my mother, enough to start a boarding house or perhaps a restaurant in San Andreas." "That is a hard road for a woman alone," Hawk said, finishing with her hands and standing. He moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire, more for something to do with his hands than because they needed the heat. "Perhaps," Thea acknowledged, "but it is my road to walk. I would rather make my own way in the world than be a burden to people who do not want me." There was a quiet strength in her voice that Hawk recognized, the same stubborn independence that had driven him to the mountains 6 years ago. He had been 28 then, fleeing a life in Sacramento that had felt like a noose slowly tightening around his neck. The expectations, the rules, the endless social niceties that meant nothing. He had wanted something real, something solid, something he could build with his own 2 hands. "You said your wagon lost a wheel," Hawk asked, changing the subject as he set a pot of water to boil for coffee. "Yes, about a mile south of here. I have a spare, but I could not lift it onto the axle by myself. The horse is still there, hobbled. I was walking to San Andreas to find someone who could help when I saw your smoke." "I will go with you after we have had some coffee and food," Hawk said. "Get your wagon fixed and make sure you can continue safely to town." He paused, ladling beans into 2 bowls from the pot that hung perpetually over his fire. "It is the least I can do after what you did for me." They ate in companionable silence, both too exhausted for much conversation. Hawk found himself sneaking glances at Thea, studying her face in the firelight. Even covered in soot and ash, even with her dress torn and her hair a mess, there was something striking about her. It was not just her physical beauty, though he could not deny she was lovely. It was something in her eyes, a determination and depth that spoke of someone who had known hardship and emerged stronger for it. After they finished eating, Hawk gathered some tools and led Thea back outside. The barn had burned down to smoldering ruins now, still smoking but no longer flaming. The animals had calmed somewhat, though they remained skittish, spread out across his property. He would need to build temporary shelter for them before nightfall, but first he needed to help Thea get on her way. They walked south along the rough trail that passed for a road in these mountains, Hawk adjusting his long stride to match Thea's shorter one. She moved with determination, despite her obvious exhaustion and injured hands, her chin up, shoulders back. Everything about her spoke of someone who refused to be defeated by circumstances. "How long have you lived up here?" Thea asked as they walked, her voice still hoarse from the smoke. 6 years, Hawk replied. "Built the cabin and barn myself, cleared the land, established the trapline. It is a hard life, but it is mine. No one telling me what to do or who to be. You do not miss other people, the company, the conversation." Hawk was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but most people I have known were not worth missing. They wanted me to be something I was not, to fit into a life that felt wrong from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep. Up here, I can just be myself. The mountains do not judge. The animals do not expect me to be anything other than what I am." "And what are you?" Thea asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "A man who prefers solitude to society, hard work to idle talk, and the company of animals to most humans," Hawk said. Then he glanced at her with the faintest hint of a smile. "Though I am finding there might be exceptions to that last part." Thea smiled back, a real smile that transformed her face despite the soot and exhaustion. "I will take that as a compliment, even if it is a backhanded one." They found Thea's wagon exactly where she had described, a sturdy traveling wagon with a canvas top, pulled by a patient bay mare that nickered softly when she saw Thea approaching. The wheel had indeed come off, and Hawk could see immediately what had happened. The linchpin had worked loose on the rough mountain road, allowing the wheel to slip off the axle. "This will be easy enough to fix," he said, examining the spare wheel secured to the side of the wagon. "But you are lucky you noticed when you did. If the wheel had come off while you were moving faster or on a steeper section of road, the wagon could have overturned." Working together, with Hawk doing most of the heavy lifting and Thea guiding and assisting where her injured hands allowed, they managed to get the spare wheel onto the axle. Hawk made sure the linchpin was secure and tested the wheel thoroughly before declaring it safe. "Thank you," Thea said, stroking her horse's nose. "I am sorry to have taken so much of your time. I know you must have a great deal to do after the fire." Hawk looked back in the direction of his homestead, where smoke still rose in a thin column against the sky. She was right. He needed to build temporary shelters for the animals, gather the scattered chickens, assess the damage, begin planning how he would rebuild. It would take days of hard work, and winter was not so far off that he could afford to waste time. But the thought of Thea continuing on to San Andreas alone, with injured hands and no real knowledge of these mountains, sat wrong with him. The town was still another 10 miles from here, and the road got rougher and more dangerous the closer it got to the mining settlement. "The sun will be setting in a few hours," he said. "These mountain roads are not safe to travel at night, especially if you do not know them. You should come back to my cabin, rest properly, let those burns begin healing. In the morning I will guide you into San Andreas myself." Thea hesitated, and Hawk could see the conflict in her eyes. The practical part of her knew he was right, but propriety dictated that an unmarried woman should not spend the night alone with a man she had just met, even in these rough frontier lands. I promise you will be perfectly safe, Hawk said, understanding her hesitation. You can have the cabin. I will sleep in the lean-to with the animals. It would not be the first time, and I need to keep watch over them tonight anyway after the fire. I do not want to put you out of your own home, Thea protested. You saved everything I care about today, Hawk said simply. The least I can do is offer you a safe place to sleep and a hot meal. Besides, I would feel better knowing you reached San Andreas safely, and I cannot escort you there today and still take care of what needs doing at my homestead. After another moment of hesitation, Thea nodded. All right. Thank you. I accept your kind offer. They hitched her mare behind the wagon and Thea climbed up onto the seat. Hawk walked beside the wagon as she drove it back to his homestead, his long legs easily keeping pace with the horse's steady walk. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, painting everything in shades of gold and green, and despite the disaster of the day, Hawk felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. Back at the cabin, Hawk set about the work that needed doing while Thea rested inside. He built a temporary shelter for the horses using canvas and rope, created a pen for Marigold and her calf using fallen logs from the forest, and spent an hour coaxing the scattered chickens back with scattered grain. Rufus helped with that last task, his herding instincts making him useful despite his age. As he worked, Hawk found his thoughts drifting back to the woman in his cabin. There was something about Thea Riley that had gotten under his skin in just a few short hours. Perhaps it was the way she had risked everything for creatures that meant nothing to her. Perhaps it was the strength he saw in her, the determination to make her own way despite the odds against her. Or perhaps it was simply that she had seen him at his most vulnerable, terrified and desperate to save his animals, and had not judged him for caring so deeply about creatures that most people considered mere property. When the immediate work was done and the animals were settled as best they could be, Hawk returned to the cabin. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He found Thea at his stove, carefully stirring a pot with her bandaged hands. "You should be resting," he said, concerned. "I wanted to help," Thea replied. "You have been working for hours while I sat idle. I found your stores and made a stew. I hope you do not mind." The smell coming from the pot made Hawk's stomach growl. He could not remember the last time someone had cooked for him. "I do not mind at all," he said, surprised at how much he meant it. "But you are my guest. You did not need to do this." "I wanted to," Thea said again, and there was something in her voice that made Hawk think she needed to contribute, to feel useful rather than burdensome. He understood that feeling all too well. They ate together as the last light faded from the sky, and this time the conversation flowed more easily. Thea told him about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the parents she had lost, and the home that no longer felt like home. Hawk found himself sharing more than he usually did, talking about his own family in Sacramento, wealthy merchants who had expected him to follow in his father's footsteps, and had been bitterly disappointed when their son had chosen mountains, and trapping over respectability and profit. "Do you ever regret it?" Thea asked. "Leaving everything behind, not once," Hawk said firmly. "I was suffocating there. Every day felt like dying by inches. Up here I am alive, I am free. What about you? Do you regret coming west?" "I have not been here long enough to regret it yet," Thea said with a slight smile. "Ask me again in a year." After dinner, Hawk gathered blankets and prepared to leave Thea the cabin for the night, but as he reached the door she called out to him. "Hawk, can I ask you something?" He turned back. "Of course. Why do you live alone up here? I understand wanting freedom and space, but 6 years with almost no human contact, that is more than just independence. What are you running from?" The question caught Hawk off guard. Most people were content with surface answers, but Thea seemed to see deeper, to the parts of himself he usually kept hidden. "I am not running from anything," he said slowly. "At least, not anymore. Maybe I was at first, but now I am just living the only life that makes sense to me. I do not fit with people, Thea. I never have. I am too blunt, too intense, too much of everything that society wants you to smooth over and hide. Up here, I do not have to pretend to be less than I am." Thea studied him in the firelight, those green eyes seeming to look right through him. "I do not think you are too much of anything," she said softly. "I think you are exactly right." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that made Hawk's breath catch in his chest. He found himself taking a step back toward her before he caught himself. "Good night, Thea," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sleep well. I will wake you at first light." Outside in the cool mountain night, Hawk made his bed in the lean-to shelter he had built, with Rufus curled up against his side and the sounds of the horses moving softly nearby. But sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept returning to the woman in his cabin, to the way she had fearlessly run into the burning barn again and again, to the quiet understanding in her eyes when she looked at him. He had been alone for 6 years, and he had been content with that solitude. But in the space of a single day, Thea Riley had somehow made him feel more lonely than all those years of isolation combined. Because now he knew what he was missing. Now he had tasted real human connection with someone who seemed to understand him, and going back to his solitary life was going to be much harder than it had been before. Morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Hawk rose with the dawn, fed the animals, and checked on the barn ruins before returning to the cabin. He found Thea already awake, braiding her auburn hair with difficulty due to her bandaged hands. She had done her best to clean the soot from her face and dress, though both still showed signs of yesterday's ordeal. "How are your hands?" Hawk asked. "Sore," Thea admitted. "But better than they might have been without your salve. Thank you again." Hawk made breakfast, simple fare of cornmeal mush and dried venison, and they ate quickly. Both of them seemed to sense that dragging out the morning would only make the eventual goodbye harder. The ride to San Andreas took most of the morning, with Hawk riding one of his horses alongside Thea's wagon. The road wound down out of the mountains and into the foothills, getting progressively wider and more traveled as they approached the mining town. They talked as they rode, sharing more stories, more pieces of themselves, and with each mile Hawk felt the knot in his chest growing tighter. He did not want to let her go. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. This woman, whom he had known for barely a day, had somehow become precious to him. The thought of returning to his empty cabin, of going back to his solitary life, filled him with a desolation he had not felt in years. But what could he offer her? A rough mountain existence, a cabin barely big enough for one person, let alone two, and a man who had chosen isolation over society. Thea deserved better than that. She deserved a real home, a real life, not the half-wild existence he had carved out for himself. San Andreas spread out before them in the valley, a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings that had sprung up around the gold discoveries in Calaveras County. It was rougher and wilder than the settlements closer to Sacramento, a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a day, where violence was common, and law was often whatever the man with the gun said it was. Hawk felt his protective instincts rising as they rode into town. This was no place for a woman alone, especially one as refined and gentle as Thea clearly was, despite her courage and strength. "You have somewhere to stay?" he asked as they navigated the muddy Main Street. I have the name of a boarding house, Thea said, pulling a piece of paper from her pocket. A friend of my mother's wrote to me about it. Mrs. Catherine Walsh runs it, apparently. She is supposed to be a respectable widow who rents rooms to decent people. I know the place, Hawk said, relieved. Catherine Walsh was indeed respectable, one of the few truly decent people in San Andreas. I will take you there. They found the boarding house on the quieter end of town, a two-story building that looked well-maintained compared to many of its neighbors. Mrs. Walsh herself answered the door, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a sensible bun. "Can I help you?" she asked. Then her eyes took in Thea's disheveled appearance and bandaged hands, and her expression shifted to concern. "Oh, my dear, what has happened to you?" "I had an accident on the road," Thea explained. "But Mr. Zimmerman here helped me. I was hoping you might have a room available. Sarah Fletcher from Missouri wrote to me about your establishment." Recognition lit Mrs. Walsh's face. "Oh yes, Sarah mentioned you might be coming." "Thea Riley, is it? Of course I have a room for you. Come in, come in. And you too, Mr. Zimmerman. Any friend of Miss Riley's is welcome here." Hawk helped Thea carry her belongings inside while Mrs. Walsh fussed over her, immediately insisting on rebandaging her hands and providing hot water for washing. The boarding house was clean and comfortable, with lace curtains and furniture that spoke of a woman who took pride in her establishment. "I will leave you to get settled," Hawk said when Thea's things were deposited in her room. He felt awkward suddenly, out of place in this domestic setting, too large and rough for the delicate furnishings. "Wait," Thea said, following him back down the stairs and out onto the front porch. "I feel like I should say something more than just goodbye. You saved me when my wagon broke, you gave me shelter, you brought me safely here. And I know I disrupted your life terribly." "You saved my animals," Hawk countered. "That is worth more to me than anything I did for you." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "If you need anything at all, my homestead is about 12 miles north of here. Anyone in town can give you directions. Do not hesitate to ask for help if you need it." "I will not," Thea promised. Then impulsively she reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you, Hawk, for everything." The touch, even through his shirt sleeve, seemed to burn. Hawk covered her hand with his own for just a moment, feeling how small and delicate it was compared to his calloused palm. "Be safe, Thea Riley," he said quietly. Then, before he could do something foolish like ask her to come back to the mountains with him, he turned and walked away. The ride back to his homestead was the longest of Hawk's life. Every mile felt like a chain wrapped around his chest, pulling tighter and tighter. He tried to tell himself he was being ridiculous, that he could not possibly have developed real feelings for someone he had known for less than 2 days. But his heart did not seem to care about logic or sense. Back at his cabin, the silence was deafening. Hawk threw himself into work, starting the process of planning and preparing to rebuild his barn. He felled trees, stripped logs, and worked from dawn until well past dark every day for a week, trying to exhaust himself enough that he would not lie awake at night thinking about green eyes and auburn hair, and a smile that had made him feel less alone than he had in 6 years. It did not work. 10 days after he had left Thea in San Andreas, Hawk was splitting logs when Rufus started barking excitedly, the old hound's tail wagging furiously. Hawk looked up to see a wagon coming up the trail, and his heart stopped when he recognized the bay mare pulling it. Thea pulled the wagon to a stop in his yard and climbed down, moving more easily than she had the last time he saw her. Her hands were still bandaged, but less heavily now, and she wore a new dress, dark blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. "Thea," Hawk said, setting down his axe and trying to keep the hope out of his voice, Is something wrong? Do you need help? No, she said, then reconsidered. Well, yes, actually, I do need help. I need help understanding something. What? Hawk asked, confused. Thea walked toward him, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. I need help understanding why, in the 10 days since you brought me to San Andreas, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. I have tried to settle in, to start making plans for my boarding house or restaurant, to build the new life I came here for. But all I can think about is you alone up here in these mountains, and how wrong it feels to be anywhere else. Hawk's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. Thea, you do not know what you are saying. You have a chance at a real life in town with people and society and comfort. I have nothing to offer you but hard work and isolation, and a half-wild man who does not know how to be anything else. You are wrong, Thea said, and there was that fierce light in her eyes again, the one he had first seen when she told him the animals were not just animals. You have everything to offer. You are kind and strong and brave. You care deeply about the things that matter. You do not hide behind false pleasantries or social games. You are exactly who you are, and that is remarkable, Hawk. That is precious. I live in the wilderness, Hawk said, even as hope began to bloom in his chest. My cabin is barely big enough for one person. I spend weeks at a time on my trapline. I have no money beyond what I make from pelts, and some years that is barely enough to buy supplies. It is a hard life, Thea. I will not lie to you about that. I grew up on a farm, Thea reminded him. I know about hard work. I know about isolation and making do with little. But I also know what it feels like to be somewhere you are supposed to be, with people who make you feel alive and real. I felt more myself in the day and a half I spent here with you than I have in the entire last year. Hawk reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large hands. Are you sure? He asked, searching her eyes. Because if you stay, if we do this, I will not be able to let you go. I am not built that way. When I care about something, I care with everything I am. I am sure, Thea whispered. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Hawk kissed her then, gently at first, mindful of her smaller size and delicate frame, but Thea rose on her toes and kissed him back with a fierceness that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Hawk rested his forehead against hers. I have been miserable without you, he admitted. These mountains have never felt so empty as they have this past week and a half. Then it is a good thing I came back, Thea said with a smile. Though I should probably return to town before nightfall, Mrs. Walsh will worry if I am gone too long, and we should probably do this properly. Court each other, spend time together, make sure this is real and not just the intensity of what we went through together. Hawk nodded, though the thought of letting her go again, even temporarily, made his chest ache. You are right. But Thea, I already know this is real. I have known it since I watched you run into that burning barn to save creatures you did not even know. But I will court you properly if that is what you need. I will come to town, call on you at the boarding house, do whatever is right and proper. I am not sure proper is possible in a place like San Andreas, Thea said with a laugh. But yes, I would like that. I would like you to come to town to spend time together away from the crisis and chaos. I want to know all of you, Hawk Zimmerman. Not just the man who saves animals and lives in the wilderness, but all the parts of you. Over the next 3 months, Hawk made the journey to San Andreas twice a week, sometimes more. He would arrive in the morning and spend the day with Thea, walking through town, sharing meals, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Mrs. Walsh proved to be a surprisingly lenient chaperone, often finding excuses to leave them alone in the boarding house parlor, though she always kept the door open a crack for propriety's sake. Thea came to visit the homestead regularly as well, helping Hawk with the work of rebuilding the barn. She proved to have a natural way with the animals, and Marigold became especially fond of her, always coming to the fence for scratches when Thea arrived. Rufus adopted her completely, following her around whenever she visited and sleeping at her feet when she sat in the cabin. They talked about everything during those months. Hawk learned about Thea's childhood, about the mother who had taught her to be strong and independent even when the world wanted women to be soft and dependent. Thea learned about Hawk's years in Sacramento, about the father who had called him ungrateful, and the society that had made him feel like a wild animal in a cage. "I think you were brave to leave," Thea told him one afternoon as they took a break from working on the barn. "So many people stay in lives that make them miserable because it is easier than facing the unknown. Or they had the courage to go find something better," Hawk said, looking at her meaningfully. "Like someone I know who packed up everything and traveled across the country alone to start a new life." Thea smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I am not sure it was courage so much as necessity. My brother's wife made it very clear I was not welcome." "Then she is a fool," Hawk said firmly. "And your brother is a fool for allowing it, but their loss is my gain, so perhaps I should thank them." As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the highest peaks, Hawk and Thea's relationship deepened as well. The attraction that had sparked between them that first day had grown into something richer and more complex. Hawk found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he had never told another living soul, and Thea did the same. They fit together in a way that felt inevitable, like two pieces of the same whole that had finally found each other. It was in late November, with winter pressing close and the first real snow beginning to fall, that Hawk finally asked the question that had been building in his heart for months. They were sitting in his cabin, which Thea had helped him expand and improve over the past weeks. It was still small, but warmer and more comfortable now, with touches that Thea had added that made it feel like a home rather than just a shelter. Rufus was asleep by the fire, and outside they could hear the soft sounds of the animals settled in the new barn for the night. "Thea," Hawk said, taking her hands in his, careful of the scars that still marked her palms from the burns. "I need to ask you something." "I know what you are going to ask," Thea said softly, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You do?" Hawk asked, surprised. "You are going to ask me to marry you," Thea said. "And the answer is yes. It has been yes since the day I came back here and told you I could not stop thinking about you." "It will always be yes, Hawk, for as long as you want me." "Forever then," Hawk said, pulling her close. "I will want you forever, Thea Riley. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You make me believe that I can have this, that I deserve this. A home, a partner, a life that is full instead of empty." "You do deserve it," Thea said fiercely. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Hawk, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." They were married in San Andreas 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church with Mrs. Walsh and a few of Thea's new friends from town as witnesses. Hawk wore new clothes that Thea had helped him choose, though he felt stiff and uncomfortable in them. Thea wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Walsh had helped her sew, and Hawk thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The preacher, a balding man named Reverend Thompson who had known Hawk slightly from his occasional visits to town for supplies, looked surprised when Hawk showed up requesting a marriage ceremony. "Did not think you were the marrying kind, Zimmerman," he had said. "Neither did I," Hawk had replied, "until I met her." After the ceremony, they returned to the homestead as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Thea had moved her belongings from the boarding house earlier in the week, and the cabin truly felt like theirs now, with both of their possessions mingled together. That first night as husband and wife, lying together in the darkness with Thea curled against his side, her head resting on his broad chest, Hawk felt a peace and contentment he had not known existed. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, stroking her hair. "Happier than I have ever been," Thea replied. "Are you?" "More than I have words to say," Hawk admitted. "You have given me something I did not even know I was missing, Thea. A partner. Someone who sees all of me and does not want me to be different. I spent so long alone because I thought that was the only way I could be myself. But you showed me that was wrong. With you, I can be myself and still have connection, still have love." "You are easy to love, Hawk," Thea said, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I know you do not think so, I know the world has told you otherwise, but you are kind and good and true. Those are the things that matter. Not whether you can make small talk at a party or pretend to care about things that bore you." Winter settled over the mountains in earnest after that, locking them into their small homestead for weeks at a time. But the isolation that had once been Hawk's refuge became something entirely different with Thea by his side. The long evenings became times for talking and reading aloud and planning for the future. The cold nights became opportunities to hold each other close and share warmth and intimacy. Thea proved to be every bit as capable and strong as Hawk had suspected. She learned to help with the trapline, to skin and prepare pelts, to manage the animals through the harsh mountain winter. She was not afraid of the hard work or the isolation, and she seemed to thrive in the wilderness the same way Hawk did. "I never felt right in cities and towns," she confessed one night as they sat by the fire. "There was always this restlessness in me, this feeling that I was meant for something different. I think I was meant for this, for you, for this life, for these mountains." "I know exactly what you mean," Hawk said, pulling her closer. "I felt wrong my entire life until I came here. And then I felt right but incomplete. But now, with you, I feel whole." Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and revealing the green world beneath. With the warmer weather came more trips to San Andreas for supplies and to sell the winter's worth of furs. Thea always came with him now, and Hawk found he did not mind the town nearly as much with her by his side. She had a way of making even the most tedious social interactions bearable, and people seemed to respond to her warmth and genuine interest in them. It was on one of these trips, in late May of 1877, that Thea shared news that would change their lives again. They were riding back toward the mountains, the wagon loaded with supplies, when she turned to Hawk with a mixture of nervousness and joy on her face. "I need to tell you something," she said. Hawk felt his stomach clench with worry. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Thea said, reaching out to take his hand. "I am expecting a baby, Hawk. We are going to have a child." Hawk pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road, staring at her in shock. "A baby? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be," Thea said. "I have been feeling unwell in the mornings, and I have missed my monthly courses twice now. Mrs. Walsh noticed and spoke to me about it. She has had children of her own and says she recognizes the signs." 1,000 emotions crashed through Hawk at once. Joy, terror, wonder, fear. A child. His child. Their child. He had never even imagined being a father, had never thought that far ahead. But looking at Thea now, seeing the hope and happiness in her eyes, he felt something shift and settle in his chest. "A baby," he repeated, and this time his voice was full of wonder. He reached out and placed his large hand gently on Thea's still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy about it?" Thea asked, and he could hear the slight uncertainty in her voice. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Hawk said, pulling her into his arms. "Terrified, amazed, overwhelmed, but yes, above all, happy. We are going to have a family, Thea. A real family." The months of Thea's pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Hawk expanded the cabin again, adding a separate room that would serve as a nursery. He built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding and polishing it until there was not a single rough edge that could hurt delicate baby skin. Thea sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands flying over the fabric with practiced skill. Mrs. Walsh came to stay with them a month before the baby was due, insisting that Thea needed an experienced woman's help for the birth. Hawk was grateful for her presence, though he chafed at being banished from the cabin when Thea's labor finally began in early January of 1878. He paced outside in the snow for hours, with only Rufus for company, listening to Thea's cries of pain and feeling utterly helpless. This was a kind of fear he had never experienced before, a terror born of love so deep it threatened to consume him. If anything happened to Thea, if he lost her, he did not think he would survive it. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard a new sound. The thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Walsh opened the cabin door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a daughter, Mr. Zimmerman. A beautiful, healthy daughter, and your wife is doing well." Hawk stumbled into the cabin, his legs suddenly weak. Thea was propped up in bed, exhausted and sweaty and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. When she saw him, she smiled. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. Hawk approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Thea placed the baby in his arms. She was so small, so impossibly tiny, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right at him. Hawk had held plenty of newborn animals in his life, had helped deliver calves and foals and puppies. But this was different. This was his child, his daughter, a whole new person who would depend on him for everything. "She is perfect," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "What should we name her?" "I was thinking Hannah," Thea said. "After your mother. Mrs. Walsh told me that was her name when I asked about your family." Hawk looked up sharply. "How did you know about my mother? I never told you her name." "I asked Mrs. Walsh to make inquiries," Thea admitted. "I know you left your family behind, but I thought you might want our daughter to carry something of them with her. Your mother died when you were young, did she not? From what I learned, she was a kind woman who loved you very much. I thought it would be a fitting tribute." Hawk felt tears prickling at his eyes, something that rarely happened. His mother had died when he was 10, and he had never stopped missing her. She had been the one person in his family who had seemed to understand him, who had not tried to force him into a mold he could not fit. "Hannah," he repeated, looking down at his daughter. "Hannah Zimmerman. Yes, that is perfect." The early months with Hannah were challenging in ways Hawk had not anticipated. The baby cried often, needing to be fed and changed and comforted at all hours. Sleep became a precious commodity that Hawk and Thea grabbed in short increments whenever they could. But even in the exhaustion and chaos, Hawk found a joy he had not known existed. Watching Thea with their daughter, seeing the gentle way she cared for Hannah, the fierce love in her eyes when she looked at the baby, made Hawk fall in love with his wife all over again. And holding Hannah himself, feeling the weight of her in his arms, the trust with which she relaxed against his chest, created a bond that went soul deep. "I never knew I could feel like this," he told Thea one night as they sat together, Hannah asleep between them. "This kind of love, this kind of contentment, you have given me everything, Thea. A home, a family, a life worth living." "We have given each other those things," Thea corrected gently. "You think you did not give me just as much. You gave me a place to belong, Hawk, a purpose beyond just surviving. You showed me what it means to be truly seen and valued for who I am. As Hannah grew from an infant into a toddler, the homestead grew as well. Hawk built additions to the cabin and the barn, expanding their operation. They acquired more animals, more land, slowly building something that felt permanent and secure. Thea started a garden that flourished in the mountain soil, providing vegetables to supplement the meat from Hawk's hunting and trapping. Neighbors began to settle in the surrounding areas, other families drawn to the beauty and opportunity of the California mountains. Hawk, who had once valued his isolation above all else, found that he did not mind the company as much as he once had. Especially when those neighbors proved willing to help in times of need and accept help in return. When Hannah was 2, Thea became pregnant again. This time Hawk was less terrified and more excited, eager to expand their family. Their son was born in the summer of 1880, another healthy baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. "What about Henry?" Hawk suggested when they discussed names. "After your father. You said he was a good man, that he loved you and supported your independence even when others thought he should rein you in." Thea's eyes filled with happy tears. "Henry, yes, that is perfect." Life settled into a rhythm over the next few years. The seasons turned, the children grew, and Hawk and Thea's love deepened and matured into something solid and enduring. There were challenges, of course. Years when the trapping was poor and money was tight. Illnesses that struck the children and had Hawk riding through the night to fetch the doctor from San Andreas. Harsh winters that tested their endurance and resources. But through it all, they had each other. And that, Hawk came to realize, made all the difference. He was no longer alone facing the world's challenges. He had a partner, someone who stood beside him and shared both the burdens and the joys. Hannah grew into a bright, curious child who followed Hawk everywhere, wanting to learn everything about the animals and the land. Henry was more reserved, quieter, but with a deep thoughtfulness that reminded Hawk of Thea. Watching them grow, teaching them the things his father had never taught him, being the kind of parent he had needed as a child, became one of Hawk's greatest sources of pride and joy. By the time 1885 rolled around, Hannah was 7 and Henry was 5. The homestead had grown into a proper ranch, with a large barn that replaced the one that had burned so many years ago, multiple outbuildings, and a cabin that had been expanded so many times it was almost unrecognizable from the simple structure Hawk had originally built. It was a spring morning, with wildflowers blooming across the meadow and the children playing outside, when Thea found Hawk working on repairing a section of fence. She came up beside him, slipping her hand into his, and together they looked out over everything they had built. "Do you ever think about that day?" Thea asked. "The day the barn caught fire and everything changed." "Often," Hawk admitted. "It was the worst day of my life and the best day of my life all at once. I lost the barn, but I gained you, and I would make that trade every single time." "I think about it too," Thea said. "About how close I came to just driving past, to minding my own business and continuing on to San Andreas. If I had done that, I would have missed all of this. This life, this family, this love. It is terrifying how easily it might not have happened." "But it did happen," Hawk said, pulling her close. "You did not drive past. You stopped. You ran into a burning barn again and again to save creatures you had never met. And in doing so, you saved me too, Thea. I did not realize it at the time, but I was dying up here all alone. Dying slowly of isolation and loneliness. You brought me back to life." "We saved each other," Thea said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "That is what love does. It saves us from the prisons we build for ourselves." They stood together in the spring sunshine, watching their children play, the animals grazing peacefully, the mountains rising strong and eternal in the distance. The life they had built together was not the life either of them had been born to or expected. But it was theirs, forged in fire and love and the courage to take chances on the impossible. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing of their children. Hannah eventually married a young rancher from the next valley over, a good man who loved her fiercely and treated her with the respect and partnership she deserved. Henry became a skilled tracker and trapper like his father, though he eventually decided to use those skills to become a guide for wealthy hunters coming to the California mountains, building a successful business that brought prosperity to the whole family. Hawk and Thea grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lined with years of sun and wind and laughter. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by all they had weathered together, all they had built and shared and survived. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Hawk took Thea on a walk to the site where the old barn had stood. It was pasture now, green and lush, with no sign of the fire that had changed everything. But they both remembered it clearly, could still smell the smoke, still feel the heat, still see the flames. 20 years, Thea marveled, leaning against Hawk's solid frame. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever. Both are true, Hawk said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Every day with you feels fresh and new, but I also cannot remember a time when you were not part of me, part of my life, part of my soul. Do you have any regrets? Thea asked. About the life you gave up for me? The solitude, the independence? Not a single one, Hawk said firmly. I did not give anything up, Thea. I gained everything. You showed me that isolation is not the same as independence, that I could be myself and still have connection. That I could be loved for exactly who I am, without having to change or hide or pretend. You did the same for me, Thea said, turning in his arms to face him. You gave me a home when I had none, a purpose when I was lost, and a love that has been the foundation of everything good in my life. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Run into that barn 100 times if it meant ending up here with you. They kissed there in the meadow where the barn had burned. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was richer and fuller than either had dreamed possible. As the sun set over the mountains that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, Hawk and Thea sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the last light fade. Their children were grown and gone to their own lives, though they visited often with grandchildren who filled the homestead with laughter and energy. Rufus had long since passed, as had many of the animals that had been saved from the fire. But there were new animals now, new life, new generations continuing the cycle. I have been thinking, Thea said, breaking the comfortable silence, about legacy, about what we leave behind. And what have you concluded? Hawk asked, taking her hand in his. That it is not about the buildings or the land or the possessions, Thea said. Those are all important, but they are not what matters most. What matters is the love we have built, the family we have raised, the life we have shared. That is what will endure long after we are gone. Our children will remember how much we loved each other, how we supported each other, how we built something beautiful out of what could have been a tragedy. You are wise, Hawk said, bringing her hand to his lips. Wiser than I ever was. I am glad I listened when you came back to me all those years ago, when you told me you could not stop thinking about me. I am glad I had the courage to believe that I deserved the happiness you offered. We both had courage, Thea said. That is what brought us together and what has kept us together. The courage to be vulnerable, to risk our hearts, to choose love even when it would have been easier to choose safety. As full darkness fell, and the stars began to emerge in the clear mountain sky, they remained there together, two people who had found in each other everything they had been missing. The fire that had brought them together had destroyed a barn, but it had built a life, a family, a love that had endured through 2 decades of challenges and triumphs. And as they finally rose and went inside to the warmth of their home, Hawk pulled Thea close one more time, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. "I love you," he said, the words as true and powerful as they had been the first time he had spoken them. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have left, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Thea Zimmerman." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," Thea replied, her voice soft but certain. "My mountain man, my love, my home, always and forever." They stood there in the doorway of the life they had built together, the past behind them full of memories, the future ahead of them uncertain but bright with possibility. Two people who had saved each other in more ways than either could count, whose love had proven stronger than fire, deeper than the mountains, and enduring as the turning of the seasons themselves. And in the morning, they would wake up together as they had for 20 years, ready to face whatever the day brought, secure in the knowledge that they would face it together. Just as they always had, just as they always would. Two hearts, two souls, bound together by love and fire and the courage to believe in the impossible.